Welcome back, friends, to episode 4 of Discernment Straight Up.
Welcome, Father Nick.
I'm Father Nicholas Pearce. And
I'm JC.
And this is our open and frank conversation about discernment, and in particular, discernment of vocations to the diocesan priesthood. We've been going through for a couple of weeks now, looking at Father Brett Brannan's book, To Save 1,000 Souls, and the accompanying reading program, the Melchizedek Project, and having a good discussion about the importance for young Catholic men to actively discern a vocation.
I never realised how deep this topic can get, and it centres around the figure of Christ, the Good Shepherd who calls us, but also has to do a lot with our response to his calling. And we've gone through a whole list of subjects already and topics. Did you want to recap?
Well, yeah, I suppose we've looked at a whole variety of things, and tonight in particular way we're going to delve even, I suppose, deeper into this question of making a diligent discernment. And so how do we as men, and how do young men in particular who are of that sort of university age group, how do you actually in good conscience be able to say that you've discerned a vocation, and you've either then with confidence been able to follow it or to put it to bed? And Father Brett, I suppose, looks at that a little bit in the chapters that we're talking about tonight, if you mean. Is it just a case of getting something off, clearing the slate so that you're free to marry, or are you actually going to put your whole heart and soul into it? Which is not always easy, JC, and you'll remember this from your own story, and you've shared a fair bit of that with us already, but sometimes that first prompting of a vocation is a bit of a surprise. And it's a bit of an unwelcome surprise sometimes. Can you remember, if you know what I mean, what that first experience of a vocation was and what that felt like?
Yeah, actually, I can remember a little bit of it. It was in my high school times, and we had a guest speaker, and he was a priest from the missions, and he came back from Nigeria, and he was speaking about how the mission life was about living a life of poverty, living the simple life, and also helping others at the same time. And that really struck a chord in me because I was so active in the community, and the realization that it could become a possibility in the future, I was excited.
That was your first?
Yeah. Okay. I was like, I could do this. Like, this is a life that can sustain me throughout the years, and the attractiveness of living a poor life, simple life, is pretty exciting. I mean, like, who wouldn't want to go to missions? Like, have you seen the movie The Mission, where the Jesuits go to different lands? It's
actually quite funny that the mission actually plays a very interesting part in my own story. So I had a slightly different experience to you, because that first inkling, whilst it was sort of exciting and nervous at the spark, I then very quickly decided that I didn't want to follow it because it didn't inspire me. But at that stage, I was in year 11 at high school, and we actually watched The Mission. And many years later, it would come back to haunt me, that great piece of music, Gabriel's Oboe from the Mission, because at the end of my discernment process, I was at a Vocations Expo stall here in Melbourne. There was a big congress in that year of vocations, and I spent the day manning a booth for the St. Vincent de Paul Society, who I was doing a lot of work with at the time. Yep. And our booth just happened to back on to the booth from Corpus Christi College, nice. The regional seminary here in Victoria.
They had a booth?
They had a booth, and it was manned all day, and they decided back in the day that they would have a video, which is pretty advanced, I suppose, in the early 2000s. To have like a flat screen and a video playing, and I still remember Father Tim Nguyen, who is a formator on the seminary now, had created this 3-minute video on loop playing.
I want to see that video.
The theme song was
Gabriel's Over.
So I spent 8 hours in the exhibition building with this song on loop behind me all day. So I think we often ask for signs, and maybe that was a sign. But yeah, I suppose for me, the initial thought of priesthood came, but then there was this sense of fear and apprehension, and I did a fair bit to avoid it for a few years there. And one of the things that I was trying to do was I was trying to convince myself that I could do all the good things that a priest did, but without any of the sacrifices.
Right.
So I started looking at lots of other...
And you're talking about like celibacy. And
celibacy,
and
poverty or
poverty,
simplicity of life, obedience. I think
Yep.
obedience is a big one, especially for young people today, to make that promise of being obedient to someone else or to the church for the rest of your life. And all of these things at that stage for an 18, 19-year-old young man were just a little bit beyond what I thought was possible.
Yep.
So I tried to sort of fulfill my life by doing all the good things that a priest did, but without having to make any of those sacrifices.
Right.
But the more and more I sort of did that, the more I realised that there was still something missing. But again, and Father Brannan speaks about this in chapter 9 of To Save 1,000 Souls, that it's actually perfectly normal for guys to go through stages of discernment.
Yes.
And that if we actually know what these stages are, and we actually see that they're not just happening in our lives, but in the lives of other men, that they can actually be really helpful in helping us progress through the stages of our discernment. So again, that first stage is that initial call, that initial spark. And that we all have that in different ways, in different places and different times. As we've discussed in the past, for a lot of young people, it happens at things like youth festivals or World Youth Day.
Major events,
It was a
Eucharistic Congress, as well as the priest visitation.
So it's really a remarkable way that God speaks to us is through these events. I was watching a video earlier today where a priest who's just been ordained in New York City was speaking about the fact that it was when a visiting priest came and spoke in his parish about vocations, and he gave his own vocations testimony. So for a lot of guys, it's when they can actually, when they hear the testimony of a seminarian or a priest or someone else who shares their life, and that it normally comes out of the blue. And it definitely did for me. That first inkling of a priesthood was a moment of complete surprise.
Yeah, right.
But it was real, and I can still to this day pinpoint the location and the place when that happens. But that's the first stage, and from that point, Father Brannan says that vocations go through 7 stages before a man is finally ordained to the priesthood.
Yeah, and he sums it up in what he calls diligent discernment.
And I think diligence is a great word because it actually implies that we actually have to do it.
Yes.
They don't just happen automatically. We actually need to progress through these various stages of discernment as we're going. So that first one is that moment of the initial call. And then the second stage, which I think is something that's really important to note, is that he speaks of a latency period. And that it's perfectly normal for the sense of a vocation to go away. Right. After you've had that first moment of fervour, that first moment of devotion, that first real rich experience, it's very common, if not essential, for it then to go away.
Right,
and to become less rich. Did you have that experience in your own discernment?
I did. So when the priest came, it sort of went away for a while to make way for my studies, developing in my relationship with my friends. And so it was just a thought at the back of my head. It calls to mind a passage from Scripture, or like a little sentence where the Israelites are always constantly seeking the Lord. So the Lord is always a step ahead of them, and they have to seek Him. And I think with that initial call, you sort of encounter the Lord, you encounter Him, and then He steps forward so that you could actually seek and try find where He is in your life. And from the moment when the priest came to our high school from graduation, it was that wandering around in that latency period, as you said, was and establishing my education as well as me as a person, so I can make a new encounter, a new discovery, and increase my relationship with the Lord.
And I think you make a really good point there, that especially if that first inkling of a vocation comes when you're young. So for me, it was when I was 16. The seminary is not going to accept you at 16. So even if you were to make your way through all the stages of discernment, you need to finish high school.
Yes.
And for a lot of guys, 1 or 2 years out of high school is something that's also very important as part of that discernment period. Other guys are ready a little sooner, just depending on what's been happening in their life. But this idea of latency it's not a bad stage in and of itself, especially if that initial fervour came when you were a little bit younger, because it's in that period of time where you do get to test the vocation a little bit. But he also points out that it's a bit of a dangerous time, because at this point, some guys think, oh, well, I don't have a vocation anymore. And their discernment stops at the latency period. So they may have been at a big event, or they may have had this really wonderful experience at a youth group or in their parish church or at a time of prayer. They've had that first spark of fervour. It's then died down, and they just say, well, very quickly, well, that was just that.
Yeah.
And now I'm not called anymore.
And that's very common, I feel, amongst those in that period, to leave it and say, well, I think it was just a feeling, and I think it was just a moment of inspiration, and there was nothing there. So it can be a dangerous time, and it is. I've seen really good men who felt the calling, but just left it alone because, I don't know, they didn't know what to do.
Yeah. And one of the things he points out is that at this time in the discernment process, for a lot of people, they become what he refers as cyber discerners. And I think it is a wonderful tool that's available now even more than before, that there is a lot of great resources out there online.
There are a lot of resources.
Whether it's books or readings or videos, there's lots of great content, lots of great vocations, testimonies. And after that initial spark, this is actually a really good time to maybe dip into some of those things. Here in the Archdiocese of Melbourne, we still do produce a number of brochures and leave them at the back of the churches. So if you're searching through a church, you might find a brochure that you could read. For me, it was things that my grandmother gave me. For many years, she would sort of give me things, or we give a lot of things out at schools and things like that, and we use the justification that even if it goes in the bottom drawer, especially around this time of year for university students or for school students, around exam time, when you're that desperate to not study the things that you are supposed to be studying, you may just happen to pick up that book on discernment or have a look at that website that you've got the link to. So discernment on the internet is an important step, and it's a helpful tool, but he then says that if it's going to go any further, we need to take our discernment off the internet again. We have to step off the online world and into the real world again. And this is where we move from that latency period back into a period of assessment. This is where I'm actually going to assess what the possibilities are. And that's really almost impossible to do completely online, because we really need to, and we discussed this last week, we need to at one point or another be able to entrust this question of a vocation to one other. And that might be our parish priest, it might be our regular confessor, it might be a priest that we've met at another event or a different occasion. It might just be a trusted older man or woman, a Catholic who we trust. But we need somebody to accompany us through the next process.
You speak of assessment, and already in my mind, because I'm a student, I think of my assessments that I'm currently doing. And doing masters, you need guidance. So I've figured out my plan. I figured out what I'm going to write in the paragraphs and the body of my essay, and I bounce it off someone who could double check and triple check the content, see if it's going the right direction, see if it's coherent. And I think that's what you're trying to say when it comes to get off the internet and do the assessment.
And it becomes really important, because at this point you're going to start addressing those fears, those things that are not quite comfortable about the idea of a vocation. And when we're facing our fears, having someone to face them with and unpack them with is often a very helpful tool, because we know that today, perhaps more than ever before, following God's call into the service of the church as a priest is not going to be easy. Indeed. And that there's great challenges, and that it's asking young men to be countercultural. And that if that doesn't bring fear into the hearts and minds of a young man who's discerning, then I'd be very surprised. And I know directly from my experience, and this was the period of time where I suppose I moved from that latency period where I'd finished high school, I'd convinced myself that I wasn't being called, but this idea kept coming back. And Father Brennan speaks about the fact that it generally comes back at the Mass and in moments of silent prayer.
Yeah.
And that's what I found. And as this kept bubbling up, I reached out to a young priest who I'd met and asked whether we could catch up with some regularity. And for the first maybe 3, 6, even 12 months, most of our catch-ups were spent with me arguing.
Yes.
I would sit on the couch in his presbytery and we would drink coffee and I would argue. There was things that I wasn't happy with. And it was really, there weren't arguments as much. It was me trying to address the things that I was fearful of about the priesthood, but also about the life of the church. Because again, for many young people, our vocation grows at the same time as our faith grows. Yeah. So having a wise older person who can help us address some of those fears and questions about the life of faith, as well as the life of vocation, are really important. Yeah. Did you have someone that accompanied you throughout your discernment?
I did, and now, like I'm in my last stages of my seminary formation, and I'm fortunate to just to be in your company. And you know how,
right, there you go. well,
and you know how I like to ask questions.
You ask lots of questions. I do know that much,
and I do know that you argue heavily about certain topics. But to get that out of your chest and to find clarity in the things that are just popping up in your mind about the priesthood, and small details about discernment, help a lot through the process. However, when I first started, I did have a few priest friends who I knew when I was a child, and I did ask them those difficult questions, those tough questions, because, unfortunately, the society does not like the choices that we make in going forward to have a vocation to the priesthood. I recently came out of a conversation and of another seminarian, and he met someone who's saying are you going to be finished with the brainwashing process? And it's those conflicts and those encounters which occur more often than you think.
Yeah, and it is. So it's a challenging time. So having people to accompany you through that process and to address those fears and to help you address some of those fears that actually might even be within yourself. Because again, for many young Catholics out there, the seminary is a very strange place. They might not even know where it is or what it involves or what those next couple of steps are. But having someone to accompany you through that sort of period and to sift through those questions is really important. And as Father Brennan points out, as you continue through this diligent discernment and you start unpacking these things, it will become clear one way or the other. If God isn't calling you to be a priest, it will become clear.
Yeah. Yes.
But if we are being diligent in this process, if we are having this discussion on a regular basis, if we are taking it to prayer and He is calling us, it will become clearer. And those fears and anxieties will slowly start to melt away. They'll never go away completely because it's a big step, as you say, but we'll become more and more comfortable with what it is that God is asking of us, which then, for Father Brennan, leads us to the next step, which is this shift in discernment. And this is the important step that is probably the hardest, I think, in today's world. But when we come to the realization that we can't go any further where we are. So for many of us, and this was definitely the case for me, that it was something I struggled with for myself for a couple of years in that initial stage and throughout the latency period. I then took it to one other through confession and then through spiritual direction, through this assessment period as I worked through the fears. And then he says, the next step is this shift in discernment where we realize that we're not going to get any further if we don't give ourselves over to the church and the seminary, which is stage 5 for Father Brannan, where the next stage of discernment comes. But he says that there's something really integral here, and I still remember the moment it happened for me, and that is when we come to that realization and the acceptance in our hearts that the seminary is not the final step.
Yeah.
That we're actually only at step 4 and 5 of a 7-step process. And that when we realize that making that step into a seminary is actually just the next step in a process.
Yeah.
And that was a really big jump for me to make. And as soon as I made it, I then had to start convincing everybody else in my life of what the decision that I'd made, because everybody else thought that I was signing my life away.
Yeah. Wow.
But that real realization that I'm only going to further my discernment in a place that is set up to help me with that process.
Yeah.
Can you remember that in your own experience?
I do remember it, and it's when you come to imagine yourself in the seminary, and you come to imagine yourself giving a lot of time, a lot of energy, in a place where you're just surrounded by like-minded people. You're surrounded by priests, and you're surrounded, of course, by God's love present in the Eucharist. And you imagine yourself just living that. Maybe 1 year you could give yourself 1 year, or a few, but you imagine yourself seriously discerning, and you come with an open mind and an open heart, and knowing that if you actually do discern out, it's not really a failure because you're going through that process. And I think that's a healthy approach to this next shifting of discernment.
And an important part of this process for me definitely was actually visiting the seminary. And I think that, and Father Brendan speaks about that, once you've actually visited and you've seen the kind of guys that are there, the place that it is, the atmosphere, especially here in Melbourne, that it's not sort of some monastic community on the edge of the world, but it's here in the heart of our diocese, and it's close to the life of the bishop and the church, and we study with lay people, and in this whole environment that keeps us connected with the life of the church. When you realise that, and for me, I still remember I'd said no to invitations to go to Open Day for about 2 or 3 years. I'd been invited by my parish priest, and then I'd been invited by my spiritual director, and then I was finally invited by a young seminarian.
Yeah, now you run it now.
now I'm part of a team that helps to run it. But I remember going in that day, and I remember just having this sense of peace, a sense that I was at home. And again, as soon as you make your way through these stages of discernment, the new fear comes, because when you realise, or when I realised that I was peaceful there, and that there was actually no other option but to go next year, when all the barriers that I had put in place had fallen away, I then panicked because I knew that there was no other option but to go next year, and that I wouldn't be happy. But there was always this great sense of peace. And I still remember coming out of the vocations director's office, having signed the application process, having this real sense of lightness that I'd finally made the decision to go.
Concrete decisions.
But also remembering that is a two-way street. And this is one of those really important points about this shift in the discernment process, is that you've carried this on your own, and maybe with the help of one other, for maybe 5 years, maybe a bit shorter, but you've carried it in a great deal of secrecy. But when we move through this next stage of application to the seminary, you're actually handing over a great percentage of it, 50%, if not more, to the church and to the work of the vocations director and the seminary staff and the bishop ultimately, and saying, now you help me. And that was one of, I think, the greatest lightening of the loads, was that I didn't have to discern this on my own anymore. That I was putting myself, and this is what he speaks of as stage 5, at the hands of the seminary. And those that the bishop has entrusted with the important role of helping men in their discernment. So there was a real sort of sense there that of freedom. And it's really counterintuitive, because one of the greatest fears is that you're giving up all of these freedoms. But actually, when you step into the seminary community, to a certain degree, there was a greater sense of freedom than ever before, because I realized that I was now entrusting myself to the church.
Yes.
And people who had been given the special charisms and gifts by the church to help with this discernment process.
And it's a training process. Like once you accept that you're going into the seminary and you give 50% or more of that discernment to one other, your formators, your bishop, they're training you to become a priest. And it's that formation towards the priesthood that you trust in. Because you come out of the seminary as a priest, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
And it's that surrendering of like, I don't have the skills yet for me to become a priest straight away. So you give yourself towards that training, and I think that lightens a lot of load for me, because like I entered in, I thought I could change the whole world and do miraculous things, but you come in and you actually don't know what you're doing.
And he speaks about this of the sense that, and again, there's a reason why a seminary process is 7 years. And for some guys, it takes even longer than that. But that throughout the process, as you grow and deepen in your understanding of the priesthood and the sense of a vocation grows within you, then so too does this great sense of peace. So this is what he speaks of as stage 6, that as you progress through your process, and we spoke about this a few weeks ago when we were looking at the question of celibacy in particular, because of course that's obviously one of those big hurdles for young guys who are thinking about making that step in, and that there's no expectation that you've got that all sorted out at the beginning of your first year, but that as you move through the stages of seminary formation, stage 6 in the discernment is that you do actually come to a sense of peace. And I think of myself, and I think of that young 18-year-old guy who sat on a couch arguing with a priest about everything. But then by the time I was in my 3rd or 4th year in the seminary, I'd started doing some study and catechism and Bible studies and deepening my prayer life. And so many of those things, as the life of the church and the beauty and the truth of the teachings of the church were opened up to me through the very course of seminary studies, I became so much more at peace with so many of these things, including the questions that I had about my own vocation, which he then says moves on to that final stage of that then allows you at the very final stage, as you're approaching those last couple of years and those last final moments of your formation, or at least your initial formation, and this is right where you're at the moment, JC,
right? This
final step of moral certitude. Now, he speaks of here in the book as sort of guys coming back into third theology. Now, that's a very American term, which we don't have the direct equivalent of that here, but I suppose the equivalent would really be the beginning of 5th or 6th year.
Yeah. Or when you begin your master's degree.
Yeah. And he said that at that point, you should be expecting a shift in your sense of vocation to a moment of moral certitude.
Yes.
And the seminary staff will tell you this even in your initial interviews. If you come in to the seminary believing you have a moral certitude that you're going to be a priest, it's a pretty good sign that you're not going to be a priest.
Yeah.
That's something that grows and develops in the life of the man as his faith life grows and develops and his sense of God's calling in his life. So they're those sort of 7 stages that he speaks of diligent discernment.
Yeah, they're big stages. Like they don't come in weeks or months. It takes some of them that take years.
Exactly. And I suppose the question is if we're not willing to make our way through that process, he uses the reference that God can't drive a parked car.
Right, yes.
Meaning you've got to get the ball rolling.
Yep.
And as soon as you start making your way through these stages, God will begin to move in your life. We've used the title discernment straight up in the sense that you've got to be standing up. You've got to be ready to actually to have a go and to start having the discussion, both with God, but then also with others about discernment. And if you are willing to make the first move, to step out of the boat, to courageously follow the Lord, then the Lord is going to be able to continue to move in your life.
Yep.
So that's it for today's episode.
Yeah, what a good episode.
7 stages of diligent discernment in one episode. So hopefully for the young guys who are listening, or those of you who are watching us live, you've found something helpful in that. Again, remember that's chapter 9 of Brett Brannan's To Save 1,000 Souls, which is available on Amazon and Kindle. and also from any good vocations office or Catholic bookshop.
I think we're on iTunes as well, aren't we?
Yeah, we're on iTunes and Apple. No, that's Google Play
Google
and
Play.
all the rest. So, next episode, we're going to be looking at how do we address those fears and concerns, and what's the difference between a fear and an appropriate fear and a lack of peace. How do we discern the differences in that? And then I want to hear about your parents' reactions, whether your mum and dad's reactions were different from each other. And then a really important topic that almost every priest that I know of, especially the young priest will speak to you, is the importance of a devotion to our Blessed Mother. And what role does Mary play in the life of discernment. So that's the next episode. Remember, if you're listening live this evening from the Archdiocese of Melbourne or Adelaide or anywhere else in Australia, you can join us in the after show catch up on Zoom. Your vocations directors should have the details. Otherwise, you can find us on the Catholic Vocations Facebook page for the Archdiocese of Melbourne. Send us through a quick message and we'll send you through the details for that. Thanks, JC.
Thanks, Father Nick.
God bless everyone.
Peace.
We'll see you next week.